Hey everyone, it's Coach Robert here with a new opening video. Now you might be surprised by the title that there should be any novelty in the Scholar's Mate since it's one of the oldest openings known in chess. Let me tell you how I arrived at this weird position of having something important to say about the Scholar's Mate. So, a few years ago I was playing chess in a bar in New Brunswick in New Jersey because that's a normal thing to do, right? And this guy was playing against me and he played Scholar's Mate, and there was something that just happened in that game where I almost could have lost the game, and it was because I wasn't able to get that much out of the opening against an experienced street hustler. So I wanted to show what I'm talking about. I think it's also worth mentioning that Carlsen and Nakamura have played the Scholar's Mate multiple times against other relatively top flight opposition. So let's take a look at that. Here's one example. This is a recent opening flop that, well, not that recent anymore. This is probably the most famous example of Carlsen playing the Scholar's Mate. This was in World Cup, if I remember correctly, and he was able to get a decent opening position. Like, this position is just equal, and it's kind of uncomfortable for black, but he slipped later in the game, some miscalculation. More interesting, though, this is his game against Dominguez, who's a very, very strong player, where he managed to make a draw with the Scholar's Mate just in this line. So I think that this setup where white rapidly deploys bishop c4, queen f3, knight e2 is equal, and there's not that much for black to look forward to. Although a draw with black is pretty good for GMs. But I think if someone's going to play Scholar's Mate against you, they must have a lot of chutzpah, so we should probably try to beat them somehow. Later on, I was thinking about this line again. Well, first of all, I've taught the Scholar's Mate so many times, like probably 1,000 times. So at some point, after telling students over and over again that if they play knight c6 and g6 and knight f6, they'll have a good opening because their opponent will probably forget to stop knight d4. I've said this so many times that after a while I was just sitting there thinking, well, my students are thinking and wondering, is this really such a good position for black? Is it as good as I hype it up to be? I mean, yeah, if your opponent plays like c3 here, right, which is a mistake, after knight a5, black is slightly better because they get to break with d5 very easily. And even if they play bishop b5, it's pretty similar, right? We're going to play these moves. And once you get that d5 break in, you actually have something to hope for because you will have more development as black, and you could try to harass their queen. But that's only if they play c3, right? This move knight e2 is pretty annoying. Luckily for most beginners, this is all you need to know about Scholar's Mate, that when they play queen h5, you don't automatically play knight f6 because they want to take your pawn, so you protect it with a piece. And then after g6, you have to just keep stopping their checkmate. But my novelty is going to be f5. Also, it's worth mentioning before we move on that after knight f6, there's this silly trap with queen b3, and this is not that well known, even though people study Scholar's Mate a lot to improve in the early stages. But the refutation, just in case you want to know about this for your own curiosities, after knight d4, bishop f7, king e7, there's not really any good place to put the queen. This is just like bonus material. This is not about my novelty. So after queen c4, b5, there's no place that they can go without losing the bishop on f7. So you can keep that tucked in your back pocket if you're still at that level where this is the kind of problem you have with Scholar's Mate. I made this video more for the people who are in a position where they're pretty good, right? They know all their chess fundamentals, they can calculate tactics and stuff, but there's just some player, maybe at their local club, who just loves to troll them by playing the Scholar's Mate and still manages to win somehow, even though you're both pretty good players. So if you're facing that kind of disrespect in your local club, I recommend the move f5. This move is probably objectively the best move, which is kind of crazy to see, especially since it's so traditional to talk about the move knight f6. Well, let's talk about what happens first if they take this pawn, right? After they take the pawn, you can go ahead and play knight d4. And the reason I showed the other variation is actually to show that knight d4 is a move you typically want to play in the Scholar's Mate as black. And here, it's pretty clear that they don't have any good moves. Because we have knight c2 on tap, they basically have to play queen d1 to avoid that, right? But if they play queen d5, you have to play queen e7. And the nice thing about this position is that if they keep grabbing pawns, like if they take here, black is much, much better. You're going to play knight f6 and kick that queen and your advantage is indisputable. So, that being said, if they take the pawn, it's garbage. But we're facing a strong opponent, right? That's the thought experiment here, that someone is stronger than you, but you are still a pretty strong opponent. They're not going to just take on f5. I mean, maybe they will, and then you'll get really, really lucky that you have a fantastic position against a strong opponent who was recently trolling you at the club. So, if they play knight e2, this is still the strongest move, just like in the other more traditional lines of Scholars Meet. And here we can build the pressure with knight f6. Knight c3 is important because if they play d3, they're already much worse. So if you want, you can pause here and see if you can figure out how black gets some advantage here. And the answer is with f4. This prevents white from finishing the development in a natural way. And bishop g4 becomes much more formidable when it actually happens. Like here, you're kind of threatening to play d5 and bishop g4, trapping the queen. So d3, a very natural move, especially if someone's like a coffeehouse chess player who just like plays the first move that comes to their mind. They could just get into a lost position here after f5. So anyway, knight c3 is better. After d6, they have another tricky move to play. They have to take on f5, because again, if they play d3, we play f4. And we're just better. It's kind of like you're playing King's Indian defense against some weird variation where they play queen f3 and didn't play d4. So it's like a much better version of King's Indian. So anyway, they have to take on f5, and black is already equalized, right? Like their development is so good, and white doesn't even have the space advantage that you usually get in a wide opening. And just as a sample of how play might continue after bishop g4, queen g3 kind of has to happen. Queen d7 is overprotecting g4, so we're preparing to move the knight. Queen h4 is probably the best move here, but I think it's much more normal for someone to play a move like bishop e3, even a strong player. Then after knight h5, queen h4, bishop e7, the initiative is with us. And we castle queenside, and really anything can happen here. I think this is much more lively than the usual variations. So if you want to give this person who plays Scholars Meet against you regularly a really hard time, this is my recommendation. f5, this funky novelty that really ought not to exist because this is such an old school opening. Anyway, I hope you guys like this. And yeah, check out my other content. Let me know what you think in the comments. I think it's pretty funny to discover something new on the Scholars Meet. Take care until next time.